Hello, Harvey. Good to see you. Thank you for
Hello,
joining
good to
me.
be here.
So, shall we begin then by tell me a little bit about how you became a Quaker? What were you looking for, and what did you find?
Oh, heaven. That is the big question. And it's a question I'm still asking myself after 77 years. I come from a nominally Orthodox Jewish background. I My parents weren't particularly religious at all, but I became extremely religious, nay, fanatical almost, um, coming up to my bar mitzvah at the age of 13. Gradually, however, I found the religious practice and teachings that I was offered to be restricting, constricting. I felt that there was just more than I was being offered. Also, I was brought up in a very closed Jewish community, which cut me off a bit from the world around me. And I kept feeling that I couldn't cope with barriers. I couldn't cope with frontiers, that I developed friendships out of my community increasingly, and I needed to explore. And my religious life became more and more liberal, and I dared to read liberal Christian writings at the age of 14, 15, and 16. Um, which led me eventually to try a Quaker meeting at the age of 18. I read about Quakers because I studied French at A level, and I read Voltaire, and Voltaire writes in the late 1720s, I think it is. He writes about Quakers, and he writes in a typical Voltairean way, which is slightly ironical, but makes Quakers seem incredibly attractive. He thought Quakers were odd, and I still do. But at the same time, he found a lot of what they had to say fascinating. And I used to, on a, I'd already given up my practice of Judaism. So on a Saturday afternoon, I used to go to the Central Library in Manchester, which was a forbidden thing to do, by the way, for an Orthodox Jew, especially to take the bus and go down to the city centre. And the Quaker meeting house was opposite the library. And I started reading the Quaker posters, very strong peace posters, social awareness posters. And I ventured into the Quaker meeting house one Sunday evening, hoping no one would see me. It was a clandestine activity for me actually to go and visit Quakers. And I thought they were mad. I'd never met people like this, mad but immensely attractive.
Hmm.
Um, and I've never forgotten one woman saying to me, um, I'm a Quaker, but I don't know about God. And in my mind, I thought she was saying, I'm a Quaker, but I don't know if God is one. And I just thought that slightly blew my mind. And I attended Quaker meeting. Then I was bolder and attended Quaker meetings um, for about 6 months or a year. Um, I loved the people, but I felt myself still too much of possibly religiously anarchist, or I thought I was a natural heretic. I still do. Um, and I found organized religion a bit too much for me, of any sort, even Quaker sort. Then I went off to university, declared to God that I was an atheist, and had nothing to do with religion for about 10 years. When I was interested in writing poetry. I always have been. And I went to a creative writing class where the teacher introduced me to Zen Buddhism. I got so interested in Zen Buddhism that I thought I'm going to be a Buddhist. So Jewish, atheist, Buddhist. But somehow I found Buddhism slightly too exotic. It was very attractive again, but
Mm. Mm.
it wasn't part of my culture. And then I remembered Quakers, and I started going to Quakers. I started. I was teaching in Dartford in Kent then, and I met a Quaker group, and I eventually moved to Southend, where I attended meeting regularly. And within 9 months, I always think 9 months is a very important time for the labor of my life. After 9 months, I applied for membership. And and ever since that was in my, I'm now talking about my, gosh, how old was I? I can't remember, my early 30s, possibly by this stage. And I've been a Quaker ever since. So there you are, in a nutshell, in a big nutshell.
Yeah, it's
Um,
so interesting. I really I like that use of the word exotic because you know, this idea that the Eastern traditions have are so interesting, and yet they're not something that's part of our culture. And I felt what a story that really impacted me was hearing that something like the Dalai Lama said, "Well, why are you exploring Buddhism when you have a perfectly good religion of your
yeah,
own?"
yes.
And it really, really hit me hard. And I thought, yes, I'm nervous or I'm suspicious of, in some way, of Christianity, whereas I'm accepting of this religion that I don't know anything about. And it really, I took that to heart and I thought, right, I need to go back to Christianity a bit more.
Mhm.
Can you say a bit more about where your faith is at the moment then? I mean, do you
Oh
do
dear,
you
dear, dear, dear.
draw on all of
I
those?
call myself on one level, I'm a theological minimalist. I take the Quaker understanding of there is something of God, of Christ within each human being, and therefore in ourselves as well, as not just looking for it in other people, um, and somehow to address and enter into relationship with that. Now, having said that, I don't find any one way of relationship the ultimate one. Um, my partner's an Anglican. I take him to church because he doesn't drive fortnightly. So I go to Quaker meeting one week and I go to the Anglicans the next week. It's a beautiful Anglican church. You might describe it as liberal high. It's very much the opposite of Quakers. Smells, bells, the whole liturgy. I'm used to that from Orthodox Judaism. Interestingly, in a way, I have no problem with liturgy. Um, the sermons are intelligent. I don't say a lot of the words. I never say the creed because intellectually they're not my they're not my path. The story of the creeds may be valid for some people as part of their relationship with the divine. They're not for me, but I'm happy to be there. I'm, and sometimes I go to meeting, and I might not so much nowadays because my meeting is a small meeting where there's not that much ministry, but I have been to meetings where the ministry hasn't spoken to me at all. So I can go to an Anglican church and get a sermon which does speak to me, and sometimes ministry at a Quaker meeting. So that's part of the paradox of life. I really do start. So where am I? I am. I'm a. I call myself a seeker and a finder and an
Mm.
explorer. That's and on my Facebook page, it asks you in your profile to define yourself. That's how I define myself. The problem of calling myself a Quaker sometimes, and I was outreach secretary for British Quakers for a long time, so I was a public face of Quakerism. But the danger of a word like Quaker or Christian or Buddhist or whatever is that people throw onto you their own projections. Oh, you're this, therefore you must be like that. And I don't like that, because if you are obsessed with a definition, you don't encounter the human being who wears the label. You're obsessed with the label.
Mm.
And to me, as an out and out extrovert, it's important that I enter into a relationship with the other, which is not defined by class, sexuality, religion, all those things. And I suppose I do call myself. I've led weekends on mysticism and so on and so forth. I suppose for me, the mystical engagement is whenever you meet a human being, that human being is alive like the burning bush that Moses found in the desert, that somehow there is something sacred within the other. And of course, that is the basis of my understanding of testimony, that what
Mm.
is witnessing to the sacred in all life. And that, so beyond that, which is quite a lot, I agree, I need exploring. But that's, I think that's my theology, you know, what it I once heard lots of people, or actually a lot of men, they were men who've been very masculinely intellectual at a Quaker meeting, and they were all defining God. Mm. And I really got fed up with that. I was sitting there in silence, trying to be loving and peaceful. And I thought, no, 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 I don't definitely. And I got up and I said, as far as I'm concerned, the only word for God is thou. And I sat down. In other words, God is the intimacy of relationship. And if you don't like the word God, don't use the word God. I'm happy with that. I'm happy using the word the inner Christ, or I could even use the word the inner Buddha, or
Hmm.
the inner way, or whatever. Um, but it is about relationship. It's not just about intellectual definition or even refusal to define. It's even beyond a refusal to define. It's daring to address the world as thou.
So, what is your relationship with God and your relation? I mean, you've talked about the relationship with others being a way into
Yes,
experiencing
yes.
God, but what is your relationship with God? How do you experience God?
I'm going to go round the block and give you a different sort of answer. Um, we went recently to a monastery, my partner and I, and we went through all the liturgy and the services and so on and so forth. And then one morning we went out into the grounds, and it was a rare, bright November day. So, and the sun was shining, and we sat outside, and we sat outside in silence. And I watched the leaves falling from the trees, and in the distance was the lake. And I had a very strong impression that this was my relationship with God, because it was a sense of total interdependence of myself, my partner, the community, the lake, the trees, and there was a total oneness. And I suppose this does go back to the Buddhist influence, or even the Zen influence within Buddhism. God is the sacred isness of things. It's the power which is not separate. It's Quakers always talk about there was that of God within. And if I have to give a sermon, and you can see I sermonize quite quickly. Um, I I see that of God between in and between. I remember reading an essay by James Hillman. I think he was a Jungian psychotherapist, and he said, "Where do I end? Do I end with my skin?" And no, I don't. And the whole trend nowadays is to talk about the oneness of all things rather than the frantic individualism with which many of us have been brought up. You know, my truth, my freedom, my this, my that, my choice. And I have a sense that ultimately it is the ourness, the our choice. Um, I must say that this is sounds a bit highfalutin, and I'm quite an impatient person. I'm quite an angry person, and so this relationship is not always established by any means, but it's my aspiration. And the elder within me elders me and says, "You talk about the oneness of things, but here you are splitting yourself up from other people again." So I realize that when I say I'm a finder, but I'm also an explorer, is that I know there was more ground to cover. Um,
Because my sense is that many of us are staying Quakers because we have found something. And
yes,
yet I do wonder if we talk about that enough and explain that enough.
we don't.
And I don't think we do, you see. I don't think there is enough of a teaching ministry. Um, there's none left, it seems
Well,
to me.
can I
Oh,
just
there is
point
a
out,
small amount.
I was outreach secretary for 20 odd years, and we used to do enquirers gatherings at Charney Manor in Oxfordshire. And I always divided the week into the weekend into the basics, worship, and testimony. And the basics was always an exploration of what we mean when we say there is that of God within each of us. And in the basic, um, the beginning of advices and queries, take heed, dear friends, to the love of truth within you, which are the leadings of God. Um, and it may be, I'm a linguist by training, so I'm used to language. I'm used to the deficiencies of language. But I think many Quakers are inhibited
Mm.
about language. And we're inhibited because so many of us have come away from traditions where language was thrust at us. We had to believe this, we had to do that. This
Mm.
is the only definition. And to be a true believer, you have to accept the definition which is given, handed down to you. And many of us don't want that anymore. Many of us have to live life to rediscover what is authentic to ourselves. And there is always the danger that if you're too passionate about these things, and if you say this is what I find, other you are actually saying to other people, this is what you must find. Within the religious life, that's very dangerous. But if you can get people to explore, it's almost like coming out for themselves. This is what I have found. This is not necessarily where the ultimate truth is. This is not necessarily the path you must take,
Mm.
but we can be companions on our paths, plural paths. Um, I think that's it. And I was thinking earlier today, actually, about the Quaker testimonies, because we talk about peace and truth and so on and so forth. And I've come up with one which isn't normally spoken about. I have a testimony to the affirmation of human beings. And that means that so many people are broken and hurt by the experience that they've been through religiously, politically, socially, etc. How can we, as human beings and a community, affirm that other human being it's almost like saying, I want to answer that of God within the other. But if I don't need to use the word God or whatever at that point, I might say, if you ask me we were talking about, what is your relationship with God? And I'm happy to talk in those terms. But if other people don't want to use those terms, it's up to me to, in a way, validate and to encourage people to explore what they have found for themselves. That's my understanding of testimony. That's how I answer that of God within the other.
So what is that affirmation of the other human, then the other person? What is it? What is it that you are affirming in them?
I'm affirming, I know it sounds a bit pious, I'm affirming their sacredness as a human being. Even though that may not be the word, it's like, it's people are put down because they're gay or lesbian or trans or a woman or from a low social status, etc., etc., etc. And we learn that, although many of us are fighting against this all our lives, it's almost as though we learn our place. And what I'm about is actually, I hope, and I hope sensitively, not always, I think, but I hope usually I'm sensitive enough to say, that doesn't fully define you. Okay, this is how you are now, here and now in society, and this has modified your way of looking at the world, etc., etc., etc. No way would I say go beyond. No, I take the gift that you have. Take the gift of being gay, the gift of being a trans, the gift, however painful that is, the, the, and say, this is the positive thing I have to offer to the world, and not allow people to put you down. And I think that's what I mean. But I've always thought of sacredness as not something to do with temples or holy books or so on, but sacredness is about the inviolate nature of each human being. There is something within each human being which is beyond all contention, which is beyond all restriction. So it's like my own life as rebelling against the restrictions that I have found.
Mm.
So you might even say it's a form of liberation. But I don't know, at the end of the day, I don't know what your liberation is. I just want I want to help other people feel they must find their way of liberation. And that their way of liberation I don't believe leads to a sort of a total individualism which doesn't give a damn about other human beings. The sort of idea of, I'm going to be free, I don't care.
Yeah.
No, that's not what it's my first book, which was my coming out lecture at Britain Yearly Meeting in 1988, I think it was called A Minority of One. And
Mm.
I actually believe that each human being is a minority, but not that separates us, but that's what we have in common. So it's
Mm.
the paradox of being a minority of one means that the community is created of the gifts of each separate person.
'Cause people don't always see the sacredness within them, do they? So I'm
Well, certainly not
wondering,
in themselves. No.
not in ourselves. We can see it in other people perhaps more clearly than ourselves.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yes,
wonder
yes.
how if you affirm individuals, are you agreeing with them? Or are you sometimes actually not agreeing with them? Like how does it how does it work when you have
Very good question. Very good question. Um, I put it in terms of freedom from and freedom to. I once heard this in a lecture when I was studying to be a teacher after I got my degree. I've never forgotten that lecture. There's a lot we have to put down. The burden we have to lay down, which is not us. Now, what does that, so once we've put all that down, what does it mean we can do? We can do what we like? No, I think there is, it leads to the realm of ethics. It's how do I use my uniqueness in the larger context of society and community? And therefore, it may be I've always wanted to go around killing people. Perhaps I've always been too inhibited to go around killing people. You know, my freedom, now I can do what I like. Is that what we mean by affirming the you know, it's not a journey totally into the unknown. So I suppose you might say I'm coming round in a circle here. I'm saying that I do feel there is an ethical code. And you might, at this point, bring in that much maligned word love. That, as Quakers often say, what does love require of us? Now, does love require that I can carry out all the negative things which I've never dared to do because I've been too inhibited to do it? No, I don't think so. So we do come back to an ethical code. The problem with the word love, or the question, what does love require of you, is that there is no one given answer. And I'm reading this very, very interesting book at the moment on Quaker testimony. It's made me see things which I'd never considered before in 40 years of being a Quaker. So I'm still exploring. And it uses the word experiment in a new way for me. If you say, what does love require from me? I have to experiment because I don't fully know. I was asked some years ago to write the introduction to a book on assisted dying. And I refused 3 times. And they came back to me and said, no, we want you to write a book, not on assisted dying as such, but how Quakers would discern what was right for them in the field of assisted dying. And I have to say, it was with great reluctance that I wrote what I did. And at the end of it, and I spent ages on it, and it was checked and monitored and so on. At the end of it, I came down to, what does compassion require in any given situation? But that at the end of the day, we don't actually fully know. So if someone is in great pain and wanted me to help, I mean, the question is it assisted suicide or is it assisted dying? Because there was a distinction here. And it came to me that the experiment of the moment is such that one would try through worship, through meditation, through consultation, through dialogue with one's own conscience, to see what the way forward is. And of course, one is also dialoguing with law and the state, the medical profession, etc., etc., etc. Now, that's a wishy-washy answer. Either are you for it or you're not for it. And one could say in principle, I feel that if someone is in very, very, very great pain and is really, really, really saying, no, I can't bear it anymore, whether there could be there could be ways of assisting that person to end their life. But that involves other people. Do you see what I'm getting at? So that at the end of the day, I don't fully know. All I can say is, I hope that what I am doing is the most loving, compassionate, way forward.
Yeah.
And one could say in traditional language, I leave it to the Holy Spirit, I leave it to God. And
Yeah.
I may be wrong,
Yeah.
and that's terrible. That is terrible.
Because you see, a few things there occurred to me that, we've had the word love and various um, words for love in other languages, I think, in the
Yes, yes,
tradition,
yes,
the translations in the Bible. And
yes.
yet nowadays in our current culture, the words around are about kindness and about being nice. And I think there's something very simplistic and trivializing about that. And we've lost some of the depth of what love means. And I wish that we'd get some of that complexity back. And I'm glad, therefore, that you've got into some of these big, issues of the day, like assisted dying. And I note as well, you talk about the importance of dialogue. And sometimes I worry that we've stopped talking about these things, that somehow Quakers today seem to have reached a certitude in certain things, and don't want to talk about it anymore. Have you heard that today all of the Quaker institutions have left Twitter and they don't want to talk to those
Yes,
kinds of
yes.
people anymore? And I'm appalled by that, you see. I just think that's leaving leaving the conversation and going off to talk to yourself in a little cupboard somewhere. And I don't see the point of that. Um,
Well, it's interesting. My response might be, how long do you go banging your head against a brick wall? For what I've never been on Twitter, so you know, um, so it's not really affected me. But I'm on Facebook, for example, and I know lots of people who, Facebook is totally trivial for some people and so on. And I tend not to put recipes on. I mean, I like seeing other people's recipes, but you know what I mean? And my partner was saying, you're on Facebook, but don't you realize that Zuckerberg is giving all his money to Trump now, etc., etc., etc. Keep him there as far as you can, but human beings only have so much energy. And I think there is a great danger for some Quakers actually to want to be martyrs. It's wonderful. I'm going to give up my life. I'm going to do this. You don't, you put niceness and kindness together. I make a distinction. Being nice is irrelevant, totally irrelevant. But actually, kindness is quite a different thing from niceness. And I don't think kindness just means, superficial gestures. I think it was the Dalai Lama who talked about. I've seen online the Dalai Lama talking about the essence of the religious life is kindness. The danger with love is that it's so distorted. The word it can mean absolutely anything you want it to mean. Um, Love is dangerous. Love leads you to the oddest of places. Then some people say, well, it depends what you mean by love. And then we go into semantics. Is there any word, including the word God, is there any word which has not been contaminated? It was Martin Buber who wrote something which I thought was fascinating. He said, just because the word God has been so foully misused throughout history, we must try to reclaim it, which is the
absolutely.
opposite of the idea. We mustn't use it anymore. Now, I am trying to reclaim the word God, but I know it's patriarchal, that it's deterministic, judgmental, etc., etc., etc. I find, interestingly, I find the phrase "the Holy Spirit" comes less fluently to me. Many Quakers talk about spirit more than God, I think. But to me, who is it who said, God is not your favorite uncle, God's an earthquake? And I liked that, you
Mm.
know, something which breaks into your life but is within you and in your community, and somehow doesn't let you rest. Jesus says, "Come to me and lay your burdens down, and I will give you rest." But that's not what happened to his disciples. Um, I have the sense of being totally challenged by the sacredness of things. Am I sufficient? The questions I ask myself is, am I sufficiently respectful? Does my ego get in the way? Um, am I allowing other human beings to blossom? You might say, well, it's not up to you to, I'm not making other people blossom, but am I getting in the way in my relationships?
But you know, you're talking about reclaiming the word God, and I'm very much with you on that. One of the things that worries me that very often Quaker meetings can be more focused on the centering down and the settling and the silence, rather than then actually finding the sacred and the God and the amazing fact of that, the amazing wonder of that, and the fire of that, if you like. And I
Yes,
see I see not quite enough of that at the heart of Quaker meetings week in, week out. And as you said, you go to church and perhaps you get a sense of that in the awesomeness of the language
yes,
and the written
yes, yes,
liturgy that they're reading out.
yes,
And unless you've got some very focused people who have done a lot of maybe hearts and minds prepared, you can end up with quite a, you know, a stodgy meeting for worship because we're only there for an hour. And by the
yes.
time you've chopped off the beginning with this and chopped off the end with that, there's just not a seriousness sometimes to encounter that sacred, whatever you call it. And
Mhm.
I like to reclaim the word God as well. So I see too much of the settling down and the lake, and I think that's a
Mhm.
great metaphor, and it's wonderful to get that stillness. But we use the stillness to hear the fire, to feel that living faith within us and that sacredness that we can experience. And I don't hear enough of this ever.
I like your phrase, we use the stone, because sometimes we are very precious about what we do. As we are Quakers, we value the silence. Well, we value the silence as a means by which, I mean, Quaker worship is a testimony, and it's a testimony to the fact that we are listening to that which is within and between. It's not the thing in itself. The Quaker worship, I was asked by somebody, what is the difference between, say, Quaker worship and Anglican worship? And it came to me, not always the case, but it came to me, a distinction might be Quakers worship is a listening, a liturgy of listening. Very often, Anglican worship is a liturgy of telling.
Mm.
Now, at its best, they are both listening. At the best, I tell you, the point of the Anglican worship, which I find most vivifying, I use the word, is when the congregation gets up, walks to the altar
Mhm.
to take communion.
Do you
Now,
take
many,
communion?
sorry,
Do you take communion?
yes, I do, I do. Shockingly, that it might be said for a Jewish Quaker, I take communion. But um, but it's there's a time when you finished the word, you stand up, your body is moving, you're moving to something which fundamentally can't be put into words.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, I have a heretical, as you might expect, understanding of what communion is. I mean, communion is taking the blood and the body, because this is an Anglican church, it's quite a high Anglican church, so it's not just a commemoration.
Mhm.
However, that's not how I see it. I am taking in the bread and the wine of the divine earth. of spirits, whether you see that as the body of Christ, or whether you see the whole of the earth, the whole of reality of ourselves as the body of Christ. And I can do that. I can do that. In fact, I was a meeting I hadn't been to for 30 odd years recently when I was giving a talk. And I was sitting in the meeting for Worship for Silence beforehand, and I had this extraordinary sense that everybody in the room was Christ. What would it mean if we lived out our lives? On one hand, how pious that sounds, how whatever, I don't know. But how would it be if whenever we met a human being, we had that reverence? And that's a challenge, as I say, I keep saying this, that's a challenge to me. I don't always do that. I can be dismissive, but then that I'm at fault at that point.
You see, I was at an Anglican service yesterday, and it was at Church of Wales, wonderful, um, the ordination of a friend of mine, and I also took communion, which I'm always in two minds about whether I should, but
Yes,
because I want to, I do, and I probably also have a heretical understanding. But like you, there's something unifying about that
yes,
that we know that as we take that bread and wine, we are as one with millions of people around the world doing the same, and
yes,
it's a
yes,
sign of unity.
yes,
And I love that. And I like what you're saying as well, is that there's a physical act of us all getting up and moving in the same
yes,
direction.
yes, yes,
And what I was thinking about on my way home last night was that it's reverence and praise, and you get a lot of that in Anglican worship and in all sorts of other evangelical worship. You get
mm,
reverence and praise, and I don't think we do that in Quakers. And the song that came to me, the hymn that came to me, was "Dear Lord and Father of Mankind," which of course is a Quaker, American Quaker, John Greenleaf Whittier, and you know, in deeper reverence, praise. And we've lost that. And I would say that there's a whole generation of our young people who've never even heard of that
but
hymn.
I'm going to jump in here because I think we're not comparing like with like. I mean, you can go to quite a few rather moribund Anglican services, and you can go to quite a few really lively, deep Quaker meetings for worship. So I think one has to be careful. Um, but I would also say about, I think there are quite a few younger Quakers, and they've started writing in the Friend, who almost going back to a sort of 18th century Quaker reverence. So I think one can talk in generalizations here, and I've been doing it myself, so I'm not blaming you. But I I think there are people who are coming to Quakers um, who look for this reverence. I think the great challenge, however, and I've got to be careful because people are going to hear this on, perhaps if they're going to, anyone's going to see it on Facebook or whatever, is that when you have a lot of people who declare that they're atheists, now they may have a different sense of reverence. They may have a different understanding of divinity, because the word atheist is, again, very, very ambiguous word. I've learned that over the years. In fact, I will never forget when someone at an early talk I gave said, I don't believe in God. Can I become a Quaker? My answer was, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because I may not believe in that one either. So I think we have
Yeah,
to be very
yeah,
careful with words.
yeah.
But I think there is something here. If you had an entirely rationalistic, materialistic understanding of the world around you, and your Quakerism is a matter of progressive politics alone, and you like recharging your batteries, and that's why you go to meetings, to recharge your batteries, then I fine, you come to meeting, That's the way forward for you. And I have met quite a few people who call themselves atheists who have rediscovered a different form of God. So that's interesting. But I just have to say, I have found that this deep reverence I'm talking about is people who don't take an entirely materialistic view of the world, who feel that there is something, I keep saying between and within, which is not just us.
Mm.
That's the point, not just us. Something, a shared depth, if you want to call it. And that's manifest in a loving reverence. That's manifest in loving reverence. And fine that we have humanists amongst us, but I am not a humanist.
Mm.
And so therefore I can, from my own experience, I don't just think of it in terms of what is the best good for the majority of people. And that's nice. Why not? But my spiritual life is not defined in those terms.
I mean, you sound reverential when you speak. Okay, so I'm going to say that you demonstrate reverence. So what I'm interested in is, does that lead you to praise? That last line that I just quoted from that hymn, in deeper reverence, praise.
I find prayer immensely difficult. Um, because words, sometimes for me, words get in the way of prayer. I mentioned this experience I had in the garden of the monastery.
Mm.
It was almost as though my body and my mind and my spirit and whatever were at prayer without
Mm.
vocalizing.
Yeah.
That's I mean, I do the one thing I always say when I go to um the Anglican Church, I always say the Lord's Prayer. That's one thing I do say. I've reinterpreted that so many millions of ways in my life that I decided I need to
Mm.
stop reinterpreting. Just say the words, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah.
Allow the
Yeah.
words to talk to me without my thinking they'd define anything.
And what you were just saying about sitting in the garden, though, I can see that that's a sense of awe and wonder and being at prayer. But is there a sense of gratitude to God? You know, praise is that kind of praise of God, praise of not just a prayer.
I tell you, my deepest prayer is the word wow.
Yeah.
And sometimes I get up in the morning. I tend to wake up quite early in the morning, and my prayer is thank you.
Mm.
And the more I go on, the less reverent it becomes. It becomes my mind filling in the blanks and not reverencing the blanks, just to allow the blanks to be. So I wrote a book of, well, a series of articles were published as a book called Words a few years ago. And I took several of the key words of the spiritual life and looked at them in terms of their etymology and how they were used. And the word prayer was one of them. And you know that the word prayer is related to the word precarious. And it was as though people prayed because they were aware of the precariousness of their lives. It's interesting that the two words are related.
Mm. Yeah.
Now, it's true, there are times when things seem to be very, very difficult. And one wants to say, oh God, or please, the sort of arrow prayer, I think it's called the arrow prayer.
Mm.
And I never forget many years ago when my father was ill, and I was traveling back from um, Southend, I think it was, where I was, may have been teaching, or could have been Dartford, and to Manchester, where my family were living. And I remember I was on a bus going up, and I phoned home, and there was no answer. Now, my mother was always at home, always at home. There was no answer, so I immediately was very, very worried. And I remember praying in a sort of conventional way, like, please let me see my father if he's dying before he goes. I remember that prayer. And my father died before I got there. And I didn't see my father. He was in hospital, and he was already taken to a mortuary and so on and so forth. And then I thought, well, does that mean your prayer was not answered in a conventional sense? But then I thought, death is part of life. And who am I to want the whole pattern of life to change because I want it to change? Now that taught me a lot about prayer. I hear the prayers in the church. Quakers talk a lot about holding in the light. I like the idea of holding in the light, because holding in the light is not the same as asking reality to change for you. Holding in the light is somehow being with the other person in the deepest way you can be. And so I talked before about God as some sort of the isness, the sacred isness of things. I think one has to respect the way things are. We live, we die. Our choice is how we deal with those realities. And I know that there are lots of people who have this idea of God, the intervening magician, who is going to make all things right. That's not my God. My God is not the intervening magician. God may be that within myself and within other people, which allows me to continue living creatively, ambiguously, lovingly. And I suppose you might well say that confession is the awareness of when you have not been living at that level. And I have said sorry. To whom or to what I have said sorry, I'm not sure. To me, the important thing is the ability to say sorry. I don't think of myself as a sinner in a conventional sense, but I see myself as a human being, hence limited.
Yeah, I think the concept of sin is an immensely useful thing.
Do
And
you?
it's I do, yes, I've really turned around on it
Mm-hmm.
because what I notice people saying in everyday life is they're kicking themselves about this and they're beating themselves up about that, and yet they don't believe in the concept of sin. And you think, well, actually, it's quite a helpful, liberating concept, I think. But what I wanted to just comment on, Harvey, is that what you've really done is simplified prayer for Quakers today as please, thank you, and sorry. And I think that's very, very, you know, it speaks to the modern age, doesn't it, of keeping things minimalist. You just said minimalist is your new approach to
Yeah,
theology.
but it's quite dead because they're not a thing in themselves. What they do, what they may do, is liberate oneself from a whole encyclopedia of um, intellectual constructs about sin and gratitude, etc., etc. But if the heart
Yeah.
says sorry, it's deeper than if the lips say 1,000 words.
Yeah. And I was interested you used the word precarious, and I do experience that when people are living in a very precarious way, even if that's just a quite a transitory phase of their lives,
Yes,
something, is very difficult. That is when people are in their most prayerful
yeah,
state, and I can see that.
yes.
And that's when you get down on your knees, and it's an instinctive, visceral response, I think, to pain. Um, and you see, this for me is the conversations that I want to have because what worries me about Quakers, and you talked about progressive politics being, potentially why people come, and perhaps why they stay. And what worries me is that our testimonies, which I think should be the fruits of the Spirit, become almost a shorthand for people. And people think, oh, well, I must do peace, I must do simplicity, I must do equality, rather than starting where we are talking about. Please, thank you, sorry. These kinds of deep reverential experiences from which peace, simplicity, equality,
Mhm.
truth naturally flow from those things. Whereas I worry sometimes that if you're aiming for peace and truth and simplicity and equality, you're going to be doing those things in a bit of a misguided way sometimes. If they're not coming from a starting point of prayer and of reverence.
Well, it's interesting. You make them sound like the creed, the Quaker creed. I've got to do this and I've got to believe that, and so on and so
That's
forth.
my worry.
Yeah,
That's my
yeah.
worry.
That's why I use the word affirmation, because I don't have an abstract concept in my mind. I've got to go around affirming everybody. Like today, how many people have I affirmed? And also, one of the interesting things about this book I'm reading about the testimonies by Rachel Muir is the fact that there is no one way of living out testaments, even the peace testimony, even the peace. I mean, I used to say when I was dealing with newcomers, look, the peace testimony does not necessarily mean you're a pacifist or you're going to refuse to join the army. I mean, that, you know, joining the army is not a question from people
Mm.
today in this country. Um, but how do you deal with your neighbor? How do you deal with somebody who makes you angry in a supermarket? In other words, it's how are you as a human being,
Mm.
not how are you ticking all the boxes and saying, well, Quakers have to do this, Quakers have to do that, Quakers have to do the other. That's not the issue. That is really not the issue, I don't think. And it's not even having a political manifesto.
Well, we
It's
do, don't we? Let's be honest. Let's
well,
be
I
honest,
do.
Harvey. This is why I'm doing these videos, Harvey, because I think we have simply become a progressive political group, and it worries me that I'll hear more about, let's just say, climate crisis than I
Yes.
will about reverence and praise.
Well, in the it sounds like blowing my own trumpet, but in the article I wrote, which I think I sent you a copy of, called Beyond Doubt, what I was trying to do was actually say that um, beyond all the testimony, or the very word testimony, protest, we're good at protesting about this, that, and t'other, is protest in favor of a witness. That's the origin, in favor of a witness. What is our witness? What is our witness? And our witness is the going back to what I said before, it's our relationship with the sacred in each other and in society and in the world. I mean, there are people who are burnt out entirely. They've spent their life protesting. They've spent their life knowing what society should be doing. They've got no energy left. Why have they no energy left? Because it's somehow removed from the heart to the head.
Yes.
It's renewed from the life to the page. And I'm not in any way putting down the social, psychological, etc., consequences of the spiritual life. In fact, you can't have a spiritual life which does not have an everyday consequence. You can't. I don't believe it's possible. I think someone called it spiritual bypassing. It's a way of not dealing with the world because you're holy. You've got your own spiritual life. No, that's not what it's about. It's how you take the holy space out into the marketplace. And if you're just in the marketplace and there is no inner depth, then you're overwhelmed by the vociferousness, the shouting, etc., because you've got nowhere inwards to go.
But have you looked around Quaker meetings sometimes? And there will be furrowed brows and a great gnashing of teeth. And what you talk about being burnt out, and people are worried about all of these things going on in the world. And that's where I think I think this teaching ministry, we're not quite doing enough of it at the moment. Somehow we're not structured well enough, or the culture perhaps is not strong enough to really focus first on reverence and praise, or whatever you want to call it, that fire within, that living fountain, whatever metaphor you want to use for it. And that's what worries me about the future. I mean, I've started these videos because I'm interested in the future of Quakerism. And this to me is the problem with the future of Quakerism. And that people, Quaker institutions have come off Twitter today because they've run out of energy. And that to me is part of the symptom of the problem. And I think, George Fox would have been horrified. You're so fired up with the energy and so enlivened by the Holy Spirit within that you have energy to go out lovingly into Twitter or X or whatever it's called, because you're fully alive at all times. If you can, you can't all, and especially institutionally. I mean, one person can't do it all, but institutionally we should be able to. But we're not. I see an exhaustion. So what do you think about the future of Quakerism?
Oh, heavens above. Gosh, I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you something. We were having. I am an elder at my meeting, and we were having a sort of area meeting discussion on Zoom, and it was a lot about the meeting houses and etc. 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 And I was slightly fed up, and I said, as far as I'm concerned, we're spending a lot of time looking at ourselves and our neighbours. It strikes me that what we want to look at is what is the role of spirituality in an age of anxiety? What have we to offer of the vision? Do you know, I don't care about the future. What have we now to offer? And right, typical Quakers, they said, okay, Harvey, we want you to address the area meeting on the theme of spirituality in an age of anxiety. And I said, I'm not going to talk about Quakerism in an age of anxiety. I'm going to talk about spirituality because it's deeper than this institution. And I mean, I'm always remembering things of anecdotes. I never forget a guy who was quite fed up with me because I said, if Quakerism died tomorrow, in the end of the day, it wouldn't be the greatest tragedy on earth. And he was very, very annoyed with me. 20 years later, I met him again. He'd become a Roman Catholic and I was still a Quaker. And I thought that was absolutely typical. I mean, I have stuck with it. I've taken my doubts and my frustrations and my anxieties in, and I've stayed with Quakers because somehow I feel this is my family. But I've always rebelled against too close the ghetto of the family. So I think there are Quakers who are prophets. I'm not saying I'm by any means that, but I think we still there are people within Friends who have still something to say. Have still something to say, and I think I sense in you a slight disillusion, if I may say so. I've had the disillusion myself. I've had the disillusion myself. But I remember, again, another memory. I was sitting on the balcony of our flat in Brighton, and I talk about prayer, and I said to the air, to the clouds, to the traffic, where am I supposed to be now? And the answer came back very clearly. You are where you are meant to be. And I moved not long after. So it wasn't the town that I was, because I moved from Brighton. That wasn't the town, but it was going back to this affirmation. I've had to work out a hell of a lot of things for myself. I've had to find, lose, misplace, rediscover what truth is for me throughout the whole of my life. And I'm still doing that. That is what I'm offering. I can only start from being a human being in this place. I suffer acute anxiety. I really do. All my spiritual life does not stop me really for getting restless, waking up in the night, in the middle of the night, thinking, oh heavens, what the world, etc., etc. So what? I get up, say thank you, prepare breakfast, have to live. And who knows what happened? You even get invitations to appear on video. You do not know. But there is a French word I used to love when I studied French philosophy, existentialism, and it was disponibilité. It means the ability to be available. One is there to be available to what of truth, what of kindness is around you. That's all you can do. I mean, really is all you can do. And if it leads you out to work, to improve, to work against climate change, or etc., 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 yeah, that's the consequence. I know lots of people in this town where we've got a very strong sustainability group, and they don't necessarily, you can't talk in spiritual terms to them. That it's a no-no, but they're working on that. And fine, they're doing wonderful work, and quite prophetic work. But what happens when the world is not changing as fast as you want? Where do you go? How do you nurse your wounds? There's a beautiful line by the poet Baudelaire, something about the world is not the sister of my dreams. And I've never forgotten that. The world is not the sister of our dreams, but it is still our sister. And that's where we're called to be.
What do you say to those people, though? Because there's lots of those in Quakers, and they are wounded and, hurting, I think, that the world is not changing.
Yes,
What do
yes.
you say to those young people who are worried about having families? I hear people saying, don't know whether to bring children into this world and
Yeah, yeah.
how to get a livelihood that's I can sit with in my conscience. And I mean, what do you say to those people?
What do I have to say? I have to be with and to listen to and to allow people to voice their own dilemmas. I think there are too many people who are full of good advice to other people. I really do. I do not have the answers to life's problems. I have my path which I'm walking on. But do the people who have these deep anxieties and dilemmas have anyone with whom to share them? Because very often it's when one is able to explore for oneself with another that one finds some sort of solution, not the solution necessarily. I mean, there are people who go around and say, well, we should, no, one shouldn't have children nowadays. Look at the world, overpopulation, limited world resources, etc., 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 and do the whole moral spiel. But you're not dealing with a statistic. You're dealing with a human being who is in pain and who is trying to work out as lovingly and compassionately as they can what is right for them. Just to say compassion, love, kindness, yeah, one can say those, and I've been talking about it. But at the end of the day, the compassionate thing is to allow someone else to find their own God.
And do you feel we do that enough? Could we do more? Could we do more of that, do you think?
Who is we? Quakers or the world or
I'm talking about the Quakers, the structures and the cultures in Quakers in Britain today. And that's the kind of theme of these videos, you know. So you don't want to give advice to individuals, which is fine. But what about for us as a society? Do you feel there are different things we should be doing, could be doing?
I always answer by a little memory. I'm going to it's just but basically I answer by memory because this is what's happened rather than an abstraction. I one of the most um, moving events that I went to was a death cafe held at yearly meeting. I think it was York, I can't remember. You know the death cafe where people
I know
come
what you mean.
together and talk about what death means to them, and that was so moving. And
Mm,
I actually saw people whom I knew in a different light.
mm.
I do think it's important to offer, especially that is one of the things I do think of as the role of places of worship. It happens to little. I mean, it's not just Quakers. I mean, I did actually go to a death cafe in the Anglican Church in Malaga in Spain. And it's similar thing happened. So it doesn't depend on the denomination. It depends on human beings willing to be vulnerable and open with each other. Um, Emma, it seems to me that you want Quakers to be this, that, and t'other. And well, fair enough. That's where I have given up wanting the society to do this and that. But I would like each meeting house. This came to me many years ago. How would it be if each meeting house was a lighthouse in its community? Some meeting houses are. They attract their light attracts people
Mm.
in precarious boats on a uncertain ocean.
Mm.
Hmm? That is happening, may not be happening enough, may not be happening where you are. But it could happen. It could happen. And Quakers being such as we are, it's up to each Quaker to make it happen. Not expect the society out there to do things.
Well, as always, Harvey, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Emma.
Let's finish there, and thank you so much for your time today.
Well, that's a pleasure. And as an extrovert, I have to say, I only know what I think Well, I'm talking to someone else. I don't always know what I think. So you've been very helpful to me. Thank you. And I just hope the sound recording has worked.
I just hope so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye then.
Go well. Go well.